Welcome to Sleepless History. I'm your host, and tonight we embark on a journey through time to explore one of history's most fascinating warrior cultures. In this episode, we'll delve deep into the world of the samurai, those legendary warriors of feudal Japan whose influence shaped not only their own society, but continues to resonate throughout the world today. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin our exploration of samurai culture, their history, their beliefs, and their lasting impact on civilization. If you enjoy tonight's story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Origins of the Samurai. To understand the samurai, we must first journey back to ancient Japan, to a time when the island nation was still finding its identity. The story of the samurai begins not with a single moment, but with the gradual transformation of Japanese society over several centuries. It is a story of power, loyalty, warfare, and honor that would define Japan for nearly 700 years. In the early centuries of Japanese civilization, around the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, Japan was undergoing significant changes. The Yamato court, centered in what is now the Nara region, was working to consolidate power and establish a centralized government modeled after the Chinese imperial system. During this period, Japan was deeply influenced by Chinese culture, adopting Buddhism, Confucian philosophy, and the Chinese writing system. The government sought to create a bureaucratic state with a professional army, much like the Tang dynasty in China. However, the reality of governance in Japan proved far more complex than the idealized Chinese model. Japan's geography, with its mountainous terrain and scattered islands, made centralized control difficult. Moreover, powerful regional families, known as clans or uji, had established their own power bases throughout the archipelago. These clans controlled land, commanded the loyalty of local populations, and maintained their own armed forces. The tension between central authority and regional power would become a defining feature of Japanese history, and from this tension, the samurai would emerge. The word samurai itself comes from the Japanese verb saburao, which means to serve or to attend. In its earliest usage, the term referred to anyone who served a person of higher status. However, by the 10th century, the word had begun to take on a more specific meaning, referring to members of the warrior class who served powerful lords and the imperial court. These early warriors were not yet the sophisticated, honor-bound figures of later centuries. They were provincial fighters, often drawn from rural areas, skilled in horseback riding and archery, who provided military service in exchange for land and position. The rise of the samurai as a distinct class can be traced to the Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1185. The Heian period takes its name from Heian-kyo, the capital city now known as Kyoto, where the imperial court resided. This was an era of relative peace and cultural flourishing, particularly in the capital, where aristocrats devoted themselves to poetry, art, and courtly pursuits. The Tale of Genji, often considered the world's first novel, was written during this period by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu. But beyond the refined world of the capital, a different reality was taking shape. As the imperial government's power weakened, regional landowners and provincial officials began to assert greater independence. The government's professional army had largely disbanded, and the responsibility for maintaining order and defending territory increasingly fell to private military forces. Wealthy landowners recruited warriors to protect their estates from bandits, rival clans, and anyone who might threaten their interests. These warriors, mounted archers skilled in combat, formed the backbone of what would become the samurai class. Two clans in particular rose to prominence during this period: the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, and the Taira, also known as the Heike. Both clans could trace their lineage to the imperial family, giving them a degree of legitimacy that other warrior families lacked. The Minamoto clan established a strong presence in eastern Japan, particularly in the Kanto region, while the Taira dominated the western provinces. Both clans provided military service to the imperial court, suppressing rebellions and maintaining order in the provinces. In doing so, they accumulated wealth, land, and power, gradually becoming forces that rivaled even the court nobles in influence. The relationship between the imperial court and these warrior clans was complex and often fraught with tension. The court aristocrats, who had long held power through their mastery of ritual, culture, and bureaucratic politics, looked down upon the warriors as provincial and uncouth. Yet they needed the military strength that the samurai provided. The warriors, for their part, sought the legitimacy and status that association with the court could provide, even as they accumulated real power through their control of land and military force. This uneasy balance was shattered in the mid-12th century by a series of conflicts that would fundamentally transform Japanese society. The first major conflict was the Hogan Rebellion of 1156, a dispute over imperial succession that drew both the Minamoto and Taira clans into court politics. This was followed 3 years later by the Meiji Rebellion of 1159, which saw the two great warrior clans turn against each other in a struggle for dominance. The Taira emerged victorious from these conflicts, and their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, became the most powerful figure in Japan, effectively controlling the imperial court while the emperor remained a figurehead. Taira no Kiyomori's rise to power marked a watershed moment in Japanese history. For the first time, a warrior had achieved supreme political power, not through aristocratic lineage or bureaucratic skill, but through military might. Kiyomori attempted to rule in the manner of a court noble, marrying his daughter to the emperor and establishing his family at the center of court life. However, his heavy-handed tactics and the privileges he granted to his clan created resentment among both the traditional aristocracy and rival warrior families. The Minamoto clan, which had been largely destroyed in the Meiji Rebellion, began to rebuild its strength under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo. From his base in Kamakura in eastern Japan, Yoritomo gathered support from warriors who were dissatisfied with Taira rule. The stage was set for a decisive conflict that would determine the future of Japan and firmly establish the samurai as the ruling class. This conflict would become known as the Genpei War, and it would be one of the most significant events in Japanese history. The Genpei War, which lasted from 1180 to 1185, was a brutal struggle that engulfed much of Japan. It pitted the Taira clan, with their base of power in the capital and western Japan, against the Minamoto clan and their eastern allies. The war saw numerous battles fought on land and sea, with both sides displaying remarkable courage and tactical skill. The conflict produced many legends and stories that would become central to Japanese cultural identity, tales of heroic warriors, tragic defeats, and ultimate triumph. One of the most famous episodes of the Genpei War was the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, a naval engagement fought in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The Taira fleet, carrying the child emperor and Toku, was decisively defeated by Minamoto forces. According to legend, rather than face capture, the young emperor's grandmother, holding him in her arms, leaped into the sea, drowning both herself and the child. Many other Taira nobles chose death over the dishonor of surrender, jumping into the waters as their ships were overrun. The Battle of Dan no Ura effectively ended the Taira clan as a political and military force and secured Minamoto victory in the war. With the defeat of the Taira, Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged as the undisputed military leader of Japan. However, Yoritomo did not seek to become emperor or to rule from the imperial capital. Instead, he established a new form of government, one that would define Japanese politics for centuries to come. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title of shogun, or Sei Taishogun, meaning barbarian, subduing generalissimo. The shogunate, or bakufu, was a military government separate from the imperial court, based in Kamakura rather than Kyoto. The emperor and the court nobility remained in the capital, retaining their ceremonial and religious functions, but real political and military power now rested with the shogun and the warrior class. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked the beginning of what historians call Japan's medieval period, an era in which the samurai would dominate Japanese society. The shogunate governed through a system of vassalage, in which warriors pledged their loyalty to more powerful lords in exchange for land and protection. This feudal system bore some similarities to medieval European feudalism, though it had its own distinctive Japanese characteristics. At the apex of this system was the shogun. Below him were the great lords known as daimyo, and below them were the various ranks of samurai warriors. The early Kamakura period established many of the institutions and practices that would define samurai culture. Yoritomo created a system of governance that balanced the need for central authority with the reality of regional power. He appointed military governors, called shugo, to oversee the provinces, and estate stewards, called jito, to manage land and collect taxes. These positions were filled by loyal samurai who were rewarded with income from the land they administered. This system ensured that power remained in the hands of the warrior class while maintaining a degree of order and stability. However, the Kamakura shogunate faced its own challenges. After Yoritomo's death in 1199, power gradually shifted to his wife's family, the Hojo clan, who ruled as regents to puppet shoguns. This created a peculiar situation in which the emperor was a figurehead controlled by the shogun, who was himself a figurehead controlled by the Hojo regents. Despite this seemingly unstable arrangement, the Hojo regents proved to be capable administrators, and the Kamakura shogunate endured for over a century. The greatest challenge to the Kamakura shogunate came not from internal conflict, but from an external threat that would test the mettle of the samurai and become a defining moment in Japanese history. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, had conquered much of Asia, including Korea and China. Kublai Khan sent emissaries to Japan demanding submission to Mongol authority. The Japanese refused, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in samurai history. In 1274, a Mongol fleet carrying approximately 40,000 troops departed from Korea and attacked the islands of Tsushima and Iki before landing on the coast of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. The samurai who opposed them were shocked by Mongol tactics, which differed greatly from traditional Japanese warfare. The Mongols fought in organized units, used explosive projectiles, and coordinated their attacks with horns and drums. Japanese samurai, by contrast, were accustomed to individual combat, with warriors announcing their lineage and accomplishments before engaging in single combat. Despite their initial confusion, the samurai fought fiercely, and the Mongol forces withdrew, possibly due to concerns about storms or supply issues. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols returned with an even larger force, estimated at over 100,000 troops in 2 separate fleets. The Japanese had used the intervening years to prepare, building defensive walls along the coast and organizing their forces more effectively. The samurai held the defensive positions along the coast, preventing the Mongols from establishing a secure beachhead. Then, in what the Japanese would come to call a divine wind or kamikaze, a powerful typhoon struck the Mongol fleet, destroying much of it and forcing the survivors to retreat. The failed invasions reinforced Japanese belief in their divine protection and became a source of national pride. For the samurai, successfully defending against the Mongol threat enhanced their prestige and solidified their position as the protectors of Japan. However, the Mongol invasions also had unintended consequences that would eventually undermine the Kamakura shogunate. The enormous cost of maintaining coastal defenses and keeping armies mobilized for years strained the resources of the warrior class. Moreover, because the invasions had been repelled before any territory was conquered, there was no new land to distribute as rewards to the samurai who had fought. Many warriors who had served loyally found themselves in debt, their economic position weakened rather than strengthened by their military service. This economic strain created resentment and discontent among the samurai class. Part 2. The Age of Wars and the Rise of the Great Clans. As the Kamakura shogunate weakened in the early 14th century, Japan entered a period of increasing political instability. In 1333, the Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore power to the imperial throne, rallying support from discontented warriors and successfully overthrowing the Kamakura shogunate. However, Go-Daigo's restoration, known as the Kenmu Restoration, lasted only 3 years. His attempts to return to direct imperial rule alienated the warrior class, who had grown accustomed to their own forms of governance and preferred the familiar structure of the shogunate. In 1336, one of Go-Daigo's generals, Ashikaga Takauji, turned against the emperor and established a new shogunate based in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. This began the Muromachi period, also known as the Ashikaga period, which would last until 1573. The Muromachi period was marked by political intrigue, cultural flourishing, and eventually devastating civil war. During this era, many of the cultural practices we associate with traditional Japan reached their peak refinement, including the tea ceremony, ink painting, landscape gardening, and no theatre. The Ashikaga shoguns, however, never achieved the same degree of control over the country that the earlier Kamakura shoguns had exercised. The great provincial lords, the daimyo, had become increasingly independent and powerful during the transition between shogunates. Many of these lords controlled substantial territories and commanded armies of thousands of samurai. While they nominally recognized the authority of the shogun, in practice they governed their domains as independent rulers, collecting taxes, administering justice, and making war on their neighbors. The weakness of central authority became tragically apparent in 1467 when a dispute over succession to the shogunate erupted into open warfare. This conflict, known as the Onin War, began as a struggle between two factions of the Ashikaga family and their supporting daimyo. What started as a political dispute in Kyoto quickly spread across Japan as various lords used the chaos as an opportunity to settle their own scores and expand their territories. The fighting was particularly devastating in Kyoto itself, which was largely destroyed during 11 years of conflict. The Onin War officially ended in 1477, but the damage to central authority was irreparable. The century that followed the Onin War is known as the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period, which lasted from approximately 1467 to 1568. This was an era of almost constant warfare as daimyo fought to expand their territories and protect their domains from rivals. The term Gekkokujo, meaning the low overcoming the high, characterized this period as traditional hierarchies broke down and power went to those who could seize and hold it through military strength and political cunning. It was an age of opportunity for ambitious men, but also an age of terrible suffering for the common people who bore the brunt of constant warfare. During the Sengoku period, the nature of warfare in Japan underwent significant changes. Armies grew larger, and battles became more organized and strategic, rather than consisting primarily of individual combat between mounted samurai. The introduction of firearms, particularly the arquebus musket brought by Portuguese traders in the 1540s, revolutionized Japanese warfare. Initially, samurai were disdainful of guns, viewing them as weapons unworthy of honorable warriors. However, practical daimyo quickly recognized the military advantage that firearms provided. The arquebus allowed relatively untrained peasant soldiers to be effective in battle, changing the composition of armies and the nature of warfare. One of the most significant battles demonstrating the importance of firearms was the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. The battle pitted the forces of Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu against the feared cavalry of Takeda Katsuyori. The Takeda clan's mounted samurai were among the most formidable warriors in Japan, and their cavalry charges had won them many victories. However, Nobunaga positioned thousands of arquebusiers behind wooden palisades and used rotating volleys of gunfire to decimate the Takeda cavalry. The Battle of Nagashino marked a turning point, demonstrating that traditional samurai warfare had to adapt to new technologies and tactics. The Sengoku period produced several remarkable figures who would ultimately reunify Japan and end the era of constant warfare. The first, and perhaps most ruthless of these, was Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 to a minor daimyo family, Nobunaga displayed military genius and political cunning from an early age. He was known for his willingness to adopt new technologies and tactics, his brutal suppression of enemies, and his hostility toward Buddhist institutions that opposed his rule. By the 1560s, Nobunaga had conquered much of central Japan and appeared poised to reunify the entire country under his rule. However, in 1582, at the age of 47, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to commit suicide in a temple that was set ablaze. Nobunaga's death could have plunged Japan back into chaos, but one of his most capable generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, moved quickly to avenge his lord's death and claim his position. Hideyoshi was a remarkable figure by any standard. Born a peasant, he had risen through the ranks through ability and ambition, something that would have been nearly impossible in earlier eras. Hideyoshi completed the work of unification that Nobunaga had begun, conquering the remaining independent daimyo and bringing all of Japan under his control by 1590. Hideyoshi implemented several policies that would have lasting effects on Japanese society and the samurai class. In 1588, he issued an edict known as the Sword Hunt, ordering that all peasants surrender their weapons. This policy was intended to prevent peasant uprisings and to create a clear distinction between the samurai class, who were permitted to carry swords, and commoners who were not. The Sword Hunt marked an important step in rigidly defining class boundaries in Japanese society. Hideyoshi also conducted extensive land surveys to determine the productivity of agricultural land and the income of various domains, creating a more efficient system of taxation and administration. Despite his domestic achievements, Hideyoshi's legacy was marred by his disastrous foreign adventures. In 1592 and again in 1597, Hideyoshi launched invasions of Korea with the ultimate goal of conquering Ming China. These campaigns were costly failures that accomplished little except the devastation of Korea and the death of tens of thousands of Japanese and Korean soldiers. The invasions also strained Japan's resources and created tensions among the daimyo, who were forced to contribute troops and supplies to the campaigns. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a 5-year-old son and a council of regents to govern until the boy came of age. Among these regents was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had been a loyal ally of both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. Ieyasu was a patient and calculating leader who had carefully built up his power base over decades. He waited for the right moment to make his move, and that moment came in 1600. A coalition of daimyo formed to oppose Ieyasu's growing influence, and the two sides met at Sekigahara in central Japan on October 21st, 1600, for one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. The Battle of Sekigahara involved approximately 160,000 warriors and lasted only a single day. However, its outcome would determine the course of Japanese history for the next 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu had carefully cultivated alliances and secured the loyalty of key daimyo through promises of land and position. During the battle, several daimyo who had initially sided with Ieyasu's enemies either defected to his side or refused to fight, tipping the balance decisively in his favour. By the end of the day, Ieyasu had won a complete victory, and his path to supreme power was clear. In 1603, Ieyasu received the title of shogun from the emperor, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan until 1868. The Tokugawa period, also known as the Edo period after the city where the shogunate was based, would be an era of peace, stability, and isolation from the outside world. It would also be the period in which samurai culture reached its fullest development and most refined expression, even as the practical military function of the samurai gradually diminished. Part 3. The Tokugawa Peace and the Golden Age of Samurai Culture. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate marked the beginning of one of the longest periods of peace in Japanese history. After more than a century of nearly constant warfare, the weapons fell silent, and Japan entered an era of stability that would last for over 250 years. This peace, known as the Pax Tokugawa, would have profound effects on Japanese society, and particularly on the samurai class, transforming these warriors into bureaucrats and administrators, while simultaneously elevating their code of honor and behavior into a highly refined cultural system. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors established a system of governance designed to prevent the kind of warfare that had plagued the Sengoku period. Central to this system was a policy called Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance. Under this system, the daimyo were required to maintain residences both in their home domains and in Edo, the shogunal capital. They were obligated to spend alternate years in Edo attending the shogun's court, and when they returned to their domains, they were required to leave their wives and heirs behind in Edo as hostages. This system served multiple purposes. It allowed the shogunate to keep close watch on the daimyo. It prevented them from building up military strength in their home territories, and it drained their financial resources by forcing them to maintain expensive households in two places and to make costly processions between their domains and the capital. The Tokugawa shogunate also implemented a rigid social hierarchy that fixed the position of each class in society. At the top of this hierarchy were the samurai, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants in that order. This ordering reflected Confucian values, which held that those who produced food and goods were more valuable to society than those who merely traded them. In practice, merchants often accumulated great wealth, but they remained legally inferior to even the poorest samurai. Within the samurai class itself, there were numerous gradations of rank and status, from the great daimyo who controlled vast domains to the low-ranking foot soldiers who served them. One of the most significant aspects of Tokugawa policy was the creation of a closed, hereditary class system. Social mobility, which had been possible during the chaotic warring states period, was now strictly prohibited. A samurai's son would be a samurai, a farmer's son would be a farmer, and so on through the generations. This rigid class system created stability, but also led to problems, particularly for the samurai class. In peacetime, there was limited need for warriors, yet the samurai were prohibited from engaging in agriculture, trade, or craft production. They were professional warriors in an age without war, and they had to find new ways to justify their privileged position in society. The answer to this dilemma was the development and refinement of samurai culture and the code of Bushido. The term Bushido, which means the way of the warrior, referred to the ethical code and ideal behavior of the samurai. While warrior codes had existed in earlier periods, it was during the peaceful Tokugawa era that Bushido was systematically articulated, refined, and elevated into a comprehensive philosophy. Bushido emphasized loyalty to one's lord above all else, courage in the face of death, honor, self-discipline, and a contempt for material gain. It incorporated elements of Buddhism, Shintoism, and Confucianism, creating a unique synthesis of philosophical and religious ideas. Several important texts from the Tokugawa period articulated the principles of Bushido. Perhaps the most famous is Hagakure, written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century. The Hagakure is a collection of commentaries and anecdotes about samurai behavior and philosophy, recorded by one of Yamamoto's students. The work is known for its uncompromising emphasis on death and loyalty. One of its most famous passages states, "The way of the samurai is found in death. When it comes to either or either, there is only the quick choice of death." This emphasis on accepting death without hesitation was central to the samurai ideal, though in practice, most samurai in the peaceful Tokugawa era never faced such a choice. Another influential work was Budo Shoshinshu, or The Code of the Warrior, written by Taira Shigesuke in the late 17th century. This text provided practical and ethical guidance for young samurai, emphasizing the importance of education, filial piety, and proper conduct in both public and private life. Unlike the Hagakure, which often seemed to glorify death, the Budo Shoshinshu presented a more balanced view of the samurai's role in a peaceful society, stressing the importance of learning, wisdom, and service to one's lord and community. The emphasis on Bushido and proper behavior had several effects on samurai culture. First, it provided samurai with a sense of purpose and identity in an age when their traditional military function was largely obsolete. By presenting themselves as moral exemplars who embodied virtue and discipline, samurai could justify their continued privileged position in society. Second, the code of Bushido established clear behavioral norms that distinguished samurai from other classes. The samurai's distinctive dress, hairstyle, and right to carry two swords became external symbols of their internal moral superiority. Third, Bushido created a heavy burden of expectation and shame. A samurai who failed to live up to the code might be expected to restore his honor through seppuku, or ritual suicide, an act that, while not common, cast a long shadow over samurai life. Seppuku, also known by the more colloquial term harakiri, was a form of ritual suicide by disembowelment. It was considered an honorable death permitted only to the samurai class. Seppuku could be performed for various reasons: to restore one's honor after a failure or transgression, to follow one's lord in death, to protest an unjust decision by a superior, or as a form of capital punishment that allowed the condemned to die with honor. The ritual was highly formalized. The samurai would dress in white, write a death poem, and then use a short blade to cut open his abdomen. Because this did not cause immediate death, a trusted second, called a kaishakunin, would stand behind the samurai and behead him at the moment of greatest pain, sparing him unnecessary suffering. While seppuku was relatively rare in practice, its existence as an option shaped samurai behavior and psychology. The knowledge that failure or dishonor might require one to take one's own life created enormous pressure to maintain proper conduct and fulfill one's duties. At the same time, the ritual of seppuku, with its emphasis on composure and courage in the face of death, became one of the most distinctive aspects of samurai culture, fascinating and horrifying observers in equal measure. In the peaceful Tokugawa era, samurai increasingly devoted themselves to cultural and intellectual pursuits. Many became scholars, studying Confucian classics, Buddhist texts, and Japanese poetry and literature. Samurai were expected to be educated, and even low-ranking warriors typically had a level of literacy far above that of common people. The ideal samurai was not merely a skilled fighter, but a cultivated person who could compose poetry, appreciate art, practice calligraphy, and engage in philosophical discussion. This cultural refinement was expressed in the phrase bunbu ryodo, meaning the dual path of learning and martial arts, which captured the ideal balance between intellectual and military accomplishments. The tea ceremony, or kanoyu, became particularly important in samurai culture. Introduced to Japan from China centuries earlier, the tea ceremony was refined and formalized during the 16th century, particularly through the work of the tea master Sen no Rikyu. The ceremony emphasized simplicity, harmony, respect, and tranquility. Participants followed precise rules of etiquette in preparing, serving, and drinking tea in a specially designed tea room. For samurai, the tea ceremony provided an opportunity to practice the same discipline, attention to detail, and mindfulness that were valued in martial arts. The tea room was also one of the few spaces in hierarchical Japanese society where, at least in theory, rank could be set aside and all participants could meet as equals. Zen Buddhism had a particularly strong influence on samurai culture. Zen emphasizes direct experience and enlightenment through meditation and mindfulness, rather than through intellectual study or devotional practices. The Zen emphasis on mental discipline, focus, and equanimity appealed to warriors who needed to maintain composure in battle. Zen monks and samurai often shared close relationships, and many samurai practiced Zen meditation. Zen aesthetics, which valued simplicity, naturalness, and the beauty of imperfection, influenced samurai taste in art, architecture, and garden design. The concept of wabi-sabi, an appreciation for the impermanent and imperfect, became central to Japanese aesthetics during this period. The martial arts themselves became more systematized and formalized during the Tokugawa period. Various schools, or ryu, developed distinctive styles and techniques in different martial arts, including swordsmanship, archery, spear fighting, and unarmed combat. These schools carefully guarded their secret techniques, passing them down from master to student through generations. While practical combat skills remained important, martial arts increasingly emphasized spiritual and philosophical dimensions. Swordsmanship, or kenjutsu, was practiced not merely as a fighting technique, but as a form of moving meditation and a path to self-improvement. This philosophical approach to martial arts would later influence the development of modern Japanese martial arts like kendo, judo, and aikido. The samurai's sword, the katana, held special significance in this culture. The Japanese sword was renowned throughout the world for its exceptional quality, combining hardness and flexibility through a complex forging process that involved folding the steel many times. Sword-making was considered almost a sacred art, and famous swordsmiths were revered as masters. The katana was more than a weapon, it was considered the soul of the samurai. The possession of a fine sword was a mark of status, and swords were often passed down through families as treasured heirlooms. A samurai might sell everything he owned before parting with his sword, and the loss of one's sword was considered a profound disgrace. The peaceful Tokugawa era also saw significant economic and social changes that affected the samurai class. Japan's population grew, cities expanded, and a vibrant commercial economy developed. Edo, the shogunal capital, became one of the largest cities in the world, with a population exceeding 1 million by the 18th century. The merchant class, though officially ranked below samurai, accumulated great wealth and developed their own sophisticated urban culture. Meanwhile, many samurai, who received fixed stipends based on rice production, found their real income declining as prices rose. Lower-ranking samurai, in particular, often lived in poverty, maintaining the appearance of their status while struggling financially. Some samurai supplemented their income through side occupations, though this was technically prohibited. They might teach martial arts or calligraphy, produce crafts, or even engage in commerce through intermediaries. However, such activities were viewed as undignified for warriors, and samurai who engaged in them were often looked down upon by their peers. The economic difficulties faced by many samurai created tensions within the class and contributed to a sense that the old order was becoming unsustainable. The Tokugawa shogunate also implemented a policy of national seclusion known as sakoku, beginning in the 1630s. This policy severely restricted Japan's contact with the outside world. Foreign trade was limited to a small number of Dutch and Chinese merchants who were permitted to operate only in the port of Nagasaki under strict supervision. Japanese citizens were forbidden from travelling abroad, and those who did faced execution upon return. Christianity, which had been introduced to Japan by Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century and had gained a significant following, was ruthlessly suppressed. The policy of seclusion was motivated partly by the shogunate's fear that Christian converts would be more loyal to the Pope than to their feudal lords, and partly by a desire to maintain control over foreign trade and prevent any daimyo from gaining power through overseas connections. The policy of seclusion had profound effects on Japan. On one hand, it contributed to political stability and allowed Japanese culture to develop in distinctive directions without foreign interference. On the other hand, it isolated Japan from technological and scientific developments occurring in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, where the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform society. This isolation would have serious consequences when Japan was eventually forced to reopen to the world in the 19th century. Despite the policy of seclusion, some information about the outside world continued to reach Japan through the limited Dutch trade connection. A small number of Japanese scholars studied Dutch learning, as Western science and technology were called, learning about Western medicine, astronomy, geography, and military technology through books imported by the Dutch. These scholars recognized that Japan was falling behind the West in certain areas, but their warnings were largely ignored by the shogunate, which was more concerned with maintaining domestic stability than with keeping pace with foreign developments. Part 4. The Decline of the Samurai and the Meiji Restoration. By the early 19th century, the Tokugawa system, which had provided stability for over 200 years, was showing signs of strain. The samurai class, bloated with members who had no real military function, drained resources from the economy. The rigid class system prevented capable individuals from lower classes from rising to positions where they could contribute most effectively. Economic problems were mounting, with inflation, poor harvests, and peasant uprisings becoming increasingly common. Meanwhile, outside Japan's shores, Western imperial powers were expanding their influence throughout Asia, bringing superior military technology and aggressive commercial interests. The crisis came to a head in 1853 when an American naval squadron under Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. Perry's ships, powered by steam and armed with modern cannons, were far superior to anything the Japanese possessed. The shogunate, recognizing that it could not resist by force, agreed to negotiate. In 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa with the United States, opening 2 ports to American ships and establishing diplomatic relations. Similar treaties soon followed with other Western powers. The opening of Japan exposed the weakness of the shogunate and led to a political crisis. Many samurai, particularly from domains in Western Japan that had long resented Tokugawa dominance, were outraged by the shogunate's capitulation to foreign pressure. They rallied around the slogan Sono Joy, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. These activists argued that the shogunate had failed in its fundamental duty to protect Japan from foreign threats, and that power should be restored to the emperor, who had been a ceremonial figure for centuries, but retained symbolic legitimacy as the descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The political turmoil of the 1850s and 1860s saw increasing violence as anti-foreign activists assassinated foreign officials and Japanese who cooperated with foreigners. The shogunate attempted to suppress this movement, but found itself increasingly unable to maintain order. Several domains, particularly Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen, began modernizing their military forces, purchasing Western weapons and adopting Western military techniques. These domains had their own grievances against the Tokugawa and saw an opportunity to reshape Japan's political structure. The crisis reached its climax in 1867 when the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji came to power, and his advisors called for the restoration of imperial rule. The last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, recognizing that the shogunate's position was untenable, agreed to resign, hoping that this would allow for a peaceful transition and that he would retain some political role. However, samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, who sought a complete overthrow of the Tokugawa system, staged a coup in Kyoto and declared the restoration of imperial rule with the emperor as the sovereign ruler of Japan. This led to the Boshin War, a brief but significant civil war fought between forces loyal to the Tokugawa and those supporting the new Meiji government. The war lasted from 1868 to 1869 and ended with the defeat of Tokugawa loyalists. Edo was handed over to imperial forces without a fight, and the city was renamed Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital, becoming the seat of the new government. The last Tokugawa forces surrendered in the northern island of Hokkaido in 1869, bringing the war to an end. The Meiji Restoration, as this transition is known, marked one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. The new Meiji government, though nominally led by the emperor, was actually controlled by a group of ambitious and reform-minded samurai from the domains that had overthrown the shogunate. These leaders recognized that Japan needed to modernize rapidly if it was to avoid being colonized by Western powers, as had happened to China and many other Asian countries. They embarked on an ambitious program of reform that would transform every aspect of Japanese society within a single generation. One of the first targets of Meiji reform was the samurai class itself. The reformers recognized that the feudal system and the privileged position of the samurai were incompatible with the modern nation-state they sought to create. In 1869, the daimyo were persuaded to return their domains to the emperor, effectively abolishing the feudal system. In exchange, they received hereditary pensions and positions in the new government. The former domains were reorganized into prefectures, administered by appointed governors rather than hereditary lords. In 1873, the government abolished the samurai's exclusive right to serve as soldiers, establishing a national conscript army in which all young men, regardless of class, were required to serve. This was a devastating blow to samurai identity, which had been built on their role as warriors. Adding insult to injury, the new army was trained and organized along Western lines, making traditional samurai military skills largely obsolete. The samurai's monopoly on violence, which had been the foundation of their power for centuries, was broken. The government also ended the samurai's right to receive stipends from the state. Initially, these stipends were converted into bonds, but many samurai, unaccustomed to managing money and desperate for cash, sold their bonds at a loss to speculators. By the late 1870s, most samurai had lost the economic foundation of their status. To add further humiliation, in 1876, the government prohibited the wearing of swords in public, stripping the samurai of the most visible symbol of their class. These reforms provoked resistance from some samurai who saw their entire way of life being destroyed. Several samurai rebellions broke out in the late 1870s, the most significant being the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. This revolt was led by Saigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration who had become disillusioned with the direction of the reforms. Saigo, who was deeply respected even by his enemies for his embodiment of samurai values, led thousands of disaffected samurai in a hopeless uprising against the government he had helped create. The Satsuma Rebellion lasted for 7 months and ended with the defeat of Saigo's forces by the modern conscript army. Saigo himself, wounded and surrounded, committed seppuku in traditional samurai fashion. His death marked the end of the samurai as a political and military force in Japanese society. However, Saigo was later pardoned and became a folk hero, symbolizing both the nobility of the old samurai values and the tragic necessity of their passing. His story would inspire countless works of literature and drama, and a statue of him stands in Tokyo to this day. While the samurai as a class was abolished, many individual former samurai played important roles in Meiji, Japan, and beyond. Some became business leaders, founding companies that would grow into major corporations. Others became bureaucrats, teachers, or military officers in the new army. The Meiji oligarchs who actually ran the government during the emperor's reign were themselves former samurai who had set out to destroy their own class in order to save Japan. The discipline, education, and sense of duty that samurai culture had instilled in them proved valuable in building a modern state, even as the feudal system that had produced them was dismantled. The Meiji government also engaged in a deliberate project of cultural construction, creating a new national identity that incorporated elements of the samurai tradition while being compatible with modern institutions. Bushido was reinterpreted and presented as the traditional spirit of all Japanese people, not just the samurai class. The values of loyalty, duty, and self-sacrifice were elevated as national virtues. This reinterpretation of Bushido served several purposes. It provided cultural continuity during a period of rapid change. It distinguished Japan from Western nations while still allowing for modernization, and it created an ideological foundation for loyalty to the nation-state and the emperor. Education became a key means of transmitting these values to the new generation. The Meiji government established a national education system in which all children, regardless of class or gender, received schooling. The curriculum emphasized loyalty to the emperor and the nation, along with modern subjects like mathematics, science, and foreign languages. Moral education drew heavily on interpretations of Bushido and Confucian ethics. Through education, the government sought to create citizens who would be both modern and Japanese, capable of adopting Western technology while maintaining a distinct national character. The military also became a vehicle for disseminating these values. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882, outlined the ethical obligations of those serving in the armed forces, drawing heavily on samurai ideals of loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice. Conscripts from farming and merchant backgrounds were expected to internalize these warrior values, even though their own class traditions were quite different. In this way, samurai culture was democratized, with its values presented as belonging to the entire nation rather than a single class. Japan's rapid modernization was remarkably successful by conventional measures. Within a single generation, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society into an industrial power with a modern military, constitutional government, and expanding economy. In 1894 to 1895, Japan defeated China in a war over influence in Korea, shocking the world and demonstrating that an Asian nation could compete with Western powers. 10 years later, in 1904 to 1905, Japan defeated Russia, becoming the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in modern warfare. These victories enhanced Japanese prestige and seemed to validate the Meiji reforms. However, the reinterpretation of Bushido and samurai values also had darker consequences. The emphasis on absolute loyalty, acceptance of death, and contempt for surrender created a military culture that was extraordinarily fierce, but also often brutal and inflexible. As Japan became increasingly militaristic in the early 20th century and embarked on wars of aggression in Asia, these values were invoked to justify actions that were often cruel and inhumane. The concept of death before dishonor led to suicidal military tactics and the mistreatment of prisoners of war, both Japanese soldiers who surrendered and enemy prisoners who were viewed with contempt for not choosing death. The kamikaze suicide pilots of World War II, who deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships, were presented as modern samurai embodying the ultimate warrior spirit. The term kamikaze, meaning divine wind, deliberately invoked the typhoon that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. While these pilots were often praised for their courage and self-sacrifice, the practice of sending young men on suicide missions reflected a troubling willingness to expend human life that drew on distorted interpretations of Bushido. After Japan's defeat in World War II, there was a complex reckoning with the samurai legacy. The Allied occupation authorities, led by the United States, sought to eliminate the militaristic and feudal elements of Japanese culture that they believed had contributed to Japanese aggression. The constitution imposed on Japan in 1947 renounced war and established democratic institutions. Feudal values and the worship of the emperor as a divine figure were officially rejected. Yet samurai culture did not disappear. In the post-war period, it was reinterpreted once again, this time emphasizing the aesthetic, philosophical, and ethical dimensions of the samurai tradition while downplaying its militaristic aspects. The martial arts, now practiced primarily as sports or paths of self-improvement, rather than combat training, gained international popularity. Films, particularly those by directors like Akira Kurosawa, presented complex portrayals of samurai that explored themes of honor, duty, and moral ambiguity. These films introduced samurai culture to global audiences and shaped international perceptions of Japan. In contemporary Japan, the samurai remain a source of cultural fascination and pride, though their legacy is contested and complex. Samurai castles, many rebuilt after wartime destruction, are major tourist attractions. Museums display samurai armor, swords, and artwork. Popular culture is filled with samurai characters, from historical dramas to manga and anime. The values associated with Bushido, such as discipline, perseverance, and attention to detail, are often invoked to explain Japanese business practices and work ethic. At the same time, there is recognition that the samurai were part of a hierarchical, feudal system that was often oppressive to common people. The samurai's right to kill commoners who showed disrespect, known as kirisute gomen, is now viewed with horror rather than admiration. The rigid class system and the subordination of individuals to authority are seen as contrary to modern democratic values. Thus, contemporary Japan maintains a complicated relationship with its samurai heritage, celebrating certain aspects while critically examining others. Part 5. Samurai Organization, Daily Life, and Social Structure. To truly understand samurai culture, we must look beyond battles and Bushido to examine how samurai society was actually organized and how samurai lived their daily lives. The reality of samurai existence was far more complex and varied than the simplified image of noble warriors living by an unchanging code of honor. The samurai class was far from monolithic. There were significant differences in status, wealth, and lifestyle between the upper and lower ranks of the warrior class. At the apex of samurai society were the daimyo, the great territorial lords who controlled domains, commanded armies, and enjoyed incomes measured in tens of thousands of koku of rice. A koku was a measure of rice equivalent to about 180 litres, enough to feed one person for a year. The wealthiest daimyo had incomes of hundreds of thousands of koku and ruled over territories with populations of hundreds of thousands of people. These men lived in castles, maintained elaborate households with hundreds or thousands of retainers, and participated in the political affairs of the nation. Below the daimyo were the upper-ranking samurai who served them. These included the karo, or senior retainers, who served as advisors and administrators, and the hatamoto, bannermen who had the privilege of directly serving the lord. These upper-ranking samurai typically had significant landholdings of their own, or received substantial stipends that allowed them to maintain their own households and retainers. They lived comfortable lives, had access to education and culture, and played important roles in domain administration. In the middle ranks were regular samurai who served as soldiers, lower-level officials, and functionaries. These men typically had modest incomes, enough to support a small household, but not to live luxuriously. They might serve as guards, administrators of small territories, or in various other capacities. While they enjoyed the privileges of samurai status, including the right to carry swords and use surnames, their daily lives were often marked by financial concerns and the need to maintain appearances on limited resources. At the bottom of the samurai class were the ashigaru, or foot soldiers. These were technically samurai, but occupied the lowest rung of the warrior class. In earlier periods, ashigaru were often recruited from the peasantry and might return to farming when not campaigning. During the Tokugawa period, they became a hereditary class, but they lived simply and had little of the cultural refinement associated with higher-ranking samurai. Many performed menial tasks and struggled to maintain samurai status while living in near poverty. The income of samurai was typically measured in koku of rice, and their stipends were paid in rice rather than money. This created certain complications. Samurai living in castle towns needed to convert their rice into cash to purchase goods and services, selling it to rice merchants. The exchange rate fluctuated, and samurai were often at the mercy of merchants who were supposed to be their social inferiors. Lower-ranking samurai in particular often found themselves in debt to merchants, a situation that caused considerable resentment and anxiety about status. The daily life of a samurai varied greatly depending on rank and period. During the Warring States period, samurai were primarily occupied with military duties, training in martial arts, maintaining weapons and armor, and participating in campaigns. However, during the long peace of the Tokugawa era, most samurai never saw combat. Instead, their daily routines revolved around administrative duties, study, and the practice of martial arts and cultural pursuits. A typical day for a mid-ranking samurai in a castle town might begin before dawn. After rising, he would perform ablutions and perhaps offer prayers at the household shrine. Breakfast would be simple, typically rice with miso soup and pickled vegetables. He would then dress in his formal clothes, which included the kamishimo, a two-piece garment consisting of a jacket with exaggerated shoulders and a hakama, or pleated trousers. He would secure his two swords, the katana and the shorter wakizashi, in his belt. These two swords, known as the daisho, were the mark of samurai status. The samurai would then report to his assigned post, which might be at the castle, a government office, or some other location depending on his duties. Much of the day would be spent in routine administrative work, keeping records, handling correspondence, supervising others, or attending meetings. The work was often tedious, and many samurai complained of boredom and the feeling that their talents were being wasted on bureaucratic tasks. In the afternoon, the samurai might have time for training in martial arts. Even in peacetime, samurai were expected to maintain their martial skills through regular practice. This might include practicing swordsmanship at a dojo, training in archery, or practicing with the spear or other weapons. Martial arts training was taken seriously, not only as a practical skill, but as a form of spiritual discipline and a way to embody samurai values. Evenings might be devoted to cultural pursuits and family time. Samurai were expected to be educated and cultured. A samurai might spend time reading Confucian classics, practicing calligraphy, composing poetry, or playing traditional musical instruments like the shakuhachi flute. Some samurai attended lectures or discussion groups where they studied texts and debated philosophical questions. Others might enjoy more social pursuits, such as attending tea ceremonies, viewing art collections, or visiting theatres to watch no or later kabuki performances. Family life for samurai was governed by strict codes and expectations. Marriages were typically arranged to benefit the families involved, creating alliances or consolidating power and resources. Romantic love was not considered a necessary basis for marriage, though affection might develop over time. A samurai was expected to show reserve and dignity in his conduct, avoiding excessive displays of emotion even with family members. However, this did not mean that samurai lacked affection for their spouses and children. Personal letters and diaries from the period revealed genuine warmth and concern for family members. The role of women in samurai families was complex and changed over time. In earlier periods, particularly during the Warring States era, women of the samurai class sometimes received martial training and participated in the defense of castles during sieges. There are records of women fighting in battles, and the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade, was particularly associated with female warriors. However, during the Tokugawa period, as peace prevailed and Confucian ideals emphasizing female submissiveness became more influential, women's roles became increasingly restricted to domestic sphere. Samurai women were expected to manage the household, raise children according to samurai values, and support their husbands' careers. They were supposed to embody virtues of loyalty, obedience, and self-sacrifice. The education of daughters focused on domestic skills, etiquette, and moral instruction, rather than martial or intellectual training. However, women from samurai families were generally literate and often educated in classical literature, music, and the arts. Some samurai women wrote poetry and prose, though they had fewer opportunities for public recognition than men. Despite these restrictions, samurai women could exercise considerable authority within the household and sometimes in broader affairs. As household managers, they controlled budgets, supervised servants, and made important decisions about daily life. In the absence of husbands who were travelling or serving elsewhere, women might act as de facto heads of household. Some women wielded political influence through their relationships with powerful men, though this influence had to be exercised discreetly to avoid accusations of impropriety. Children in samurai families were raised with clear expectations about their future roles. From an early age, they were taught samurai values and expected to show self-control and discipline. Physical punishment was not uncommon, and children were deliberately subjected to hardships to toughen them and teach them to endure suffering without complaint. Boys began training in martial arts at a young age, often starting with wooden swords before graduating to real weapons as they grew older. They also received academic education, learning to read and write, studying Confucian classics, and sometimes learning Chinese, which was the language of classical scholarship. Girls were prepared for their future roles as wives and mothers. They learned domestic skills such as sewing, cooking, and household management. They also received education in etiquette, proper behavior, and often in the arts, as these accomplishments were valued in potential wives. The ultimate goal of their education was to prepare them to be effective partners to samurai husbands and to raise the next generation of warriors according to proper values. The samurai household typically included not just the nuclear family, but also servants, retainers, and sometimes extended family members. Wealthier samurai might maintain considerable establishments with many servants and retainers, while poorer samurai might have only a small household or even no servants at all. The maintenance of appearances was important for samurai, and even those with limited means tried to maintain a household befitting their status, which could create significant financial strain. Housing for samurai varied by rank and location. High-ranking samurai might live in substantial residences within castle compounds or in privileged districts of castle towns. These homes were built in traditional Japanese style, with wooden post and beam construction, sliding doors covered with paper or silk, tatami mat flooring, and separate rooms for different functions. The architecture emphasized simplicity and natural materials, reflecting Zen aesthetic principles. Gardens were important features of samurai residences, designed to provide beauty, tranquility, and a connection to nature. Lower-ranking samurai lived in more modest homes, sometimes little better than those of well-off commoners. In some domains, poor samurai lived in barrack-like accommodations provided by their lord. Regardless of the size or quality of the dwelling, samurai homes typically included a tokonoma, an alcove for displaying art or calligraphy, and a household shrine for religious observances. The home was supposed to reflect samurai values of simplicity, order, and discipline. Food for samurai families was generally simple, reflecting both practical considerations and philosophical values that emphasized austerity and self-discipline. The staple was rice, supplemented by miso soup, pickled vegetables, and occasionally fish or other protein. Meat was rarely eaten, partly due to Buddhist influence, and partly because Japan's geography and agriculture were not conducive to raising livestock. Tea was the common beverage. Wealthier samurai might enjoy more elaborate meals on special occasions, but the ideal was to eat simply and avoid luxury. Clothing for samurai was distinctive and regulated by sumptuary laws that specified what different classes and ranks could wear. The samurai's everyday clothing was the hakama and haori combination with the two swords thrust through the belt. For formal occasions, samurai wore the kamishimo mentioned earlier. The fabric, patterns, and colours of clothing were regulated according to rank, with certain designs and materials restricted to the upper ranks. Samurai were expected to maintain a neat and dignified appearance at all times, as slovenliness was considered a disgrace to one's lord and family. One of the most distinctive aspects of samurai appearance was the hairstyle known as the chonmage. This involved shaving the front and top of the head and gathering the remaining hair into a top knot. The style was practical for wearing helmets in battle, but it continued during the peaceful Tokugawa era as a mark of samurai status. Different variations of the top knot indicated different ranks and roles within the samurai class. When a samurai retired or became a monk, he would cut off his top knot in a significant ritual marking the end of his active service. Religious life for samurai drew on multiple traditions. Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, was influential in samurai culture, providing philosophical frameworks for understanding life and death. Many samurai practiced meditation and sought instruction from Zen monks. Buddhist temples served important functions in samurai communities, not only as places of worship, but as schools, meeting places, and eventually as the sites where family graves were maintained. The Buddhist emphasis on the impermanence of life resonated with warriors who faced the possibility of death in battle. At the same time, samurai observed Shinto practices, particularly those related to kami, the spirits or gods of Shintoism. Shrines dedicated to various kami dotted the landscape, and samurai would make offerings and prayers for success, protection, and good fortune. Shinto rituals marked important life transitions such as births, coming-of-age ceremonies, and marriages. Confucianism provided ethical guidelines for samurai behavior, emphasizing loyalty, filial piety, and proper conduct in social relationships. These three traditions were not seen as contradictory, but as complementary aspects of spiritual and moral life. Part 6. The Samurai Legacy and Global Impact. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through samurai history, it is worth reflecting on the lasting impact of samurai culture both within Japan and on the wider world. The samurai existed as a distinct class for approximately 700 years, from the late 12th century to the late 19th century. Yet their influence extends far beyond those centuries and far beyond Japan's shores. The samurai have become global icons, symbols of discipline, honor, and martial skill that continue to fascinate people around the world. Within Japan, the samurai legacy is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, the samurai are remembered as noble warriors who defended Japan and embodied virtues that many Japanese still admire. The emphasis on duty, loyalty, and self-discipline that characterized samurai culture continues to influence Japanese society, though often in subtle and evolving ways. The concept of giri, or duty and obligation, which was central to samurai ethics, remains an important value in Japanese society, shaping how people understand their responsibilities to family, employers, and community. The aesthetic sensibilities developed by the samurai, particularly during the Tokugawa period, have had a lasting influence on Japanese art and culture. The appreciation for simplicity, natural beauty, and imperfection that characterized samurai taste continues to define Japanese aesthetic traditions. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, landscape gardening, and other cultural practices that were refined by the samurai remain important aspects of Japanese cultural identity. Even the minimalist design that characterizes much contemporary Japanese architecture and product design can be traced back to aesthetic principles that the samurai embraced. The martial arts that developed from samurai combat training, have become international phenomena. Judo, which was developed in the late 19th century by Kano Jigoro as a modern adaptation of Jujutsu, became an Olympic sport and is practiced by millions worldwide. Kendo, or the way of the sword, evolved from samurai swordsmanship and is practiced in countries around the globe as both a sport and a form of character development. Aikido, developed in the 20th century by Morihei Ueshiba, synthesized various martial traditions with spiritual philosophy to create a defensive art focused on harmony and non-aggression. Karate, though Okinawan rather than samurai in origin, was influenced by Japanese martial traditions as it developed and spread internationally. These modern martial arts retain philosophical and ethical dimensions that reflect their samurai heritage. Practitioners are taught to respect their teachers and opponents, to pursue self-improvement rather than just competitive victory, and to develop character along with physical skills. The dojo, or training hall, is treated as a sacred space where certain etiquette must be observed. Through these practices, elements of samurai culture are transmitted to new generations, including many who have no Japanese heritage and live thousands of miles from Japan. The influence of samurai culture on Japanese business practices has been much discussed, though sometimes overstated or romanticized. The emphasis on loyalty to one's company, the hierarchical nature of Japanese corporations, and the importance of consensus and harmony in decision-making have sometimes been attributed to samurai values. However, the relationship between historical samurai culture and modern business practices is complex and indirect. Many aspects of Japanese business culture developed in response to post-World War II conditions rather than from direct continuity with feudal traditions. Nevertheless, the rhetoric of Bushido and samurai values has sometimes been invoked in business contexts, and certain attitudes about duty, perseverance, and group loyalty may have roots in the samurai tradition. The global fascination with samurai began in earnest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as Japan opened to the West and Westerners encountered Japanese culture. Early Western observers were often struck by what they perceived as the exotic and romantic aspects of samurai culture. Books like Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written in English by Inazo Nitobe in 1899, introduced Western audiences to idealized versions of the samurai code. Nitobe, who wanted to explain Japanese ethics to Westerners, presented Bushido as comparable to European chivalry, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice while downplaying less appealing aspects of samurai culture. This romanticized view of the samurai gained further currency through various cultural products. In the 20th century, films became the primary medium through which global audiences encountered samurai. Japanese director Akira Kurosawa created several masterpieces featuring samurai characters, including Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Sanjuro. These films, which combined action, moral complexity, and striking visuals, found appreciative audiences in the West. Kurosawa's work influenced filmmakers around the world, and his samurai films were remade in different cultural contexts. Seven Samurai became The Magnificent Seven, a Western set in Mexico. Yojimbo was remade as A Fistful of Dollars, launching Sergio Leone's spaghetti western genre. The influence flowed in both directions. Kurosawa himself was influenced by Western literature and film, particularly the works of Shakespeare and John Ford. This cross-cultural exchange enriched both Japanese cinema and global film culture, demonstrating how the samurai tradition could speak to universal human themes of honor, duty, sacrifice, and moral choice. The enduring popularity of these films has helped maintain global interest in samurai culture across generations. In literature, samurai have been the subjects of countless works, both in Japan and internationally. In Japan, historical novels set in the samurai era remain perennially popular. Works like Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi, a fictionalized biography of the legendary swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, have been bestsellers and have been adapted numerous times for film and television. These stories often explore themes of personal growth, the tension between duty and personal desire, and the meaning of honor in complex moral situations. Western authors have also been drawn to samurai subjects. James Clavell's novel Shogun, published in 1975, introduced many Western readers to the samurai world, even if through a romanticized and sometimes historically inaccurate lens. More recently, authors like David Mitchell in The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet have explored the encounter between samurai-era Japan and the West with greater nuance and historical awareness. These works help sustain international interest in samurai history and culture. In popular culture, samurai imagery and themes have proliferated in various media. Manga and anime, Japanese comics and animation, frequently feature samurai characters and settings. Series like Rurouni Kenshin, set in the early Meiji period, and Samurai Champloo, which creatively blends samurai themes with hip-hop culture, have found international audiences. Video games set in samurai Japan, such as the Nioh series and Ghost of Tsushima, allow players to virtually experience being a samurai, albeit in highly stylized and often historically inaccurate ways. This global spread of samurai imagery has sometimes led to misunderstandings and oversimplifications. The samurai are often portrayed as uniformly noble, honorable warriors bound by an unchanging code of conduct. In reality, as we have discussed, samurai society was diverse and complex. Samurai behavior varied widely, and the code of Bushido was largely articulated during a peaceful period when samurai had ceased to be primarily warriors. The romanticized image of the samurai can obscure the hierarchical, often brutal nature of feudal society and the real hardships experienced by common people under samurai rule. There is also a risk of cultural appropriation, in which elements of samurai culture are taken out of context and used in ways that distort their original meaning or significance. When people with no connection to Japanese culture adopt superficial elements of samurai imagery or philosophy without understanding their historical and cultural context, it can lead to misrepresentation. However, there is also genuine cross-cultural exchange when people approach samurai history and culture with respect, curiosity, and a willingness to learn, seeking to understand rather than simply to appropriate. In Japan itself, there has been ongoing debate about how to remember and represent the samurai heritage. During the post-World War II occupation, there was a deliberate effort to move away from militaristic values, and for a time, samurai culture was viewed with some suspicion as having contributed to Japanese militarism. However, as Japan regained its sovereignty and confidence, there was a revival of interest in traditional culture, including samurai history. Today, samurai are generally viewed as part of Japan's historical heritage rather than as models for contemporary behavior, though the values associated with them continue to be debated. Historical tourism focused on the samurai era is a significant industry in Japan. Castles, many of which were destroyed during the Meiji period or World War II, and later reconstructed, attract millions of visitors each year. Museums dedicated to samurai culture display armor, swords, and other artifacts, telling the story of these warriors and the society they dominated. Towns that served as castle towns during the Tokugawa period preserve historical districts and offer experiences designed to give visitors a taste of samurai-era life. This tourism both preserves historical memory and shapes how the samurai are remembered, often emphasizing the attractive aspects of samurai culture while downplaying the violence and inequality that characterized feudal society. The question of what lessons, if any, can be drawn from samurai culture for the contemporary world is complex. Some argue that samurai values of discipline, loyalty, and dedication to excellence offer useful principles that can be applied in modern contexts, from business to personal development to the martial arts. The emphasis on continuous self-improvement, the acceptance of hardship in pursuit of mastery, and the importance of honor and integrity are seen as timeless virtues. Others caution against uncritically adopting values from a feudal warrior culture. The samurai's absolute loyalty to their lords came at the expense of individual autonomy and could lead to blind obedience. The rigid hierarchies of samurai society were fundamentally opposed to democratic and egalitarian values. The samurai's readiness to use violence and their contempt for those they considered beneath them are clearly incompatible with modern ethical standards. Moreover, the romanticized version of Bushido that circulates in popular culture often bears little resemblance to the complex and sometimes contradictory reality of historical samurai behavior. Perhaps the most balanced approach is to understand samurai culture as a historically specific phenomenon that emerged from particular circumstances and served particular functions in its time. We can study it with fascination and even admiration for certain aspects without needing to adopt it as a model for contemporary life. The samurai's emphasis on skill, discipline, and honor can inspire us, while their embrace of hierarchy, violence, and rigid social roles should be understood as products of their time, not timeless virtues. One area where the samurai legacy might offer genuine insight is in thinking about the relationship between tradition and change. The samurai, over their long history, repeatedly adapted to new circumstances. They evolved from provincial warriors to sophisticated bureaucrats and cultural leaders. They adopted new technologies, from firearms to Western military techniques, when necessary. Yet they also maintained a strong sense of identity and continuity, preserving traditions and values even as the world around them changed. This ability to honor the past while adapting to the present is perhaps the most relevant lesson the samurai offer to our own rapidly changing world. The story of the samurai also reminds us of the complex relationship between military power and political authority. For much of Japanese history, the samurai held military power while emperors retained symbolic legitimacy. This separation of functions created a unique political system that was remarkably stable for long periods. It also created tensions and contradictions that eventually contributed to the system's collapse. Understanding how societies organize and legitimize power, and how military and civilian authority can be balanced or come into conflict, remains relevant for understanding politics in any era. Finally, the samurai story illustrates the power of cultural narratives in shaping identity and behavior. The code of Bushido, though largely articulated in a period when samurai were no longer primarily warriors, had real effects on how samurai understood themselves and behaved. The stories samurai told about themselves, the values they professed, and the ideals they upheld shaped Japanese history in profound ways, for better and worse. This reminds us of the importance of the stories societies tell about themselves and the values they choose to celebrate and transmit to future generations. As we conclude our long journey through the history of the samurai, we have travelled across more than 7 centuries of Japanese history. We have seen the samurai emerge from provincial warriors to become the ruling class of a great nation. We have witnessed their transformation from crude fighters to sophisticated cultural leaders who embodied an intricate code of honour and behaviour. We have observed their sudden fall from power during the Meiji Restoration and the complex legacy they left behind. The samurai were neither the perfectly noble warriors of romantic legend, nor simply brutal enforcers of feudal hierarchy. They were human beings living in specific historical circumstances shaped by the political, economic, and social conditions of their time. They created a culture that valued loyalty, honour, discipline, and martial skill, but also one that was hierarchical, often violent, and built on the labour of those beneath them in the social order. Their legacy is visible in Japan today, in aesthetic traditions, martial arts, and certain social values. It has also spread around the world, influencing film, literature, and popular culture far beyond Japan's shores. The samurai have become global icons, though often in simplified or romanticized forms that bear limited resemblance to historical reality. Understanding samurai history requires us to look beyond the myths and examine the complex reality of feudal Japanese society. It requires us to appreciate the cultural achievements of the samurai while also acknowledging the limitations and problems of the system they upheld. It asks us to consider what values from the past might still be relevant today and which should be understood as products of a very different time. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will dream of ancient Japan, of mist-shrouded castles, of warriors meditating in Zen gardens, of the clash of swords and the quiet contemplation of a tea ceremony. Perhaps you will imagine the lives of these complex figures who left such a mark on history, struggling with the same fundamental human questions we still grapple with today. How should one live with honour? What does one owe to others? How can one find meaning in an uncertain world? The samurai are gone. The last warriors who bore that title passed away over a century ago, but their story endures, continuing to fascinate, inspire, and provoke thought. It is a story that belongs not just to Japan, but to world history, a testament to the complexity of human societies and the enduring power of cultural traditions. Thank you for joining me on this journey through samurai history. This has been Sleepless History. May your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with the wisdom of the ages. Good night.